Hello and welcome to this presentation about Chapter 25 of Teach Yourself Grammar, which is about ellipses and clauses of comparison. So first, a little bit of context. We've now completed our overview of the grammar basics, which in essence is how words, phrases, and clauses are formed. In this chapter, as well as the next, we're going to look at two basic ways that these structures can be modified. One is through ellipses, which just mean omission of words, and the second is movement. After that, we'll move on to applications, namely punctuation in chapter 27, and then two chapters on style, 28 and 29. Okay, so what is ellipses? First of all, we can distinguish between two different kinds of ellipses, the first of which is optional. So optional ellipsis often involves things like subordinating conjunctions, as in the book which I read, which can become the book I read, and also in imperatives. So for example, you continue normally becomes just continue. It's most common in coordinate structures, which we studied in chapter 21. So for example, if you consider an expression like kings and queens of England, so in something like kings and queens of England range from the 9th century until the present time. Now, initially, you might be tempted to construe, in terms of a phrase structure tree, to construe this as NP and NP, where the coordinating conjunction and links up these two structures, these two conjuncts, into a coordinate structure, into a coordinate noun phrase. So if you consider the phrase structure tree that I've drawn here, kings and queens of England, with the prepositional phrase of England just modifying queens, you can see that this is not really going to work. And the reason for that is because the prepositional phrase of England modifies both kings and queens. So that the underlying structure can be better understood in the following way. So that I have kings of England and queens of England with the first prepositional phrase of England omitted. And the second kind of ellipsis that we're going to see is primarily in clauses of comparison. So for example, in Superman is stronger than Batman is strong, the is strong is typically omitted. And the difference between optional ellipsis and required ellipsis is a little bit loose in that we can obviously put the is strong back in there. We can say Superman is stronger than Batman is strong. However, in ordinary language, we're not going to put that in. So in fact, we're just going to say Superman is stronger than Batman. And that's what we mean by required ellipsis. Okay, let's take a closer look at clauses of comparison. First of all, these are adverbial subordinate clauses, and they are adverbial in function. Secondly, they use adverbial conjunctions. We've already seen that the way that adverbial conjunctions are formed is simply that you take a normal declarative clause and you add a subordinating conjunction, an adverbial subordinating conjunction. And that's the case here. They most commonly use the adverbial conjunctions than, or, as. And thirdly, as an adverbial clause, they do usually modify an adjective phrase or an adjectival. The second thing about them is that they are preceded by a focusing word or morpheme that acts as a signal to let us know a comparison is coming. So for example, in the sentence Superman is stronger than Batman, with the omitted is strong, if we analyze this for a moment, we can see that the focusing morpheme is the comparative ER on the end of stronger. So stronger tells us that a comparison is coming up, and we need to complete that comparison. Stronger than what, or stronger than who? And that's coming up then, and that's completed then, rather, by the subordinate clause than Batman, again with the omitted is strong. So the than is the subordinated conjunction, and than Batman is strong is the whole adverbial clause. Than Batman is strong modifies the adjective stronger. So stronger than what? Stronger than Batman is strong. Looking at another sentence, Batman is more intelligent than Superman, with the omitted is intelligent. Here the focusing word is more. So more tells us that we have a comparison coming up, more intelligent than who or what. And again, this is completed by the subordinate clause, the adverbial clause, than Superman, again with the omitted is intelligent. And something to look out for is that this comparison doesn't necessarily have to involve the comparative or even the superlative form. We can have something like as agile as in Catwoman is as agile as Robin is agile. So here as is the focusing word. It is paired with a second as, which is typically the case with as, and the subordinate clause, as Robin, with the omitted is agile, does modify the adjective agile here. On to a point of usage. So there are two things to look out for here. The first is when you don't have the clause of comparison. That is, you have the focusing word or morpheme, but you don't have the clause of comparison to complete that thought. So we have a sentence like, Batman was a grimmer hero. And if you think about this, there's a comparison that's implied, but it isn't stated. So probably something like, Batman was grimmer than earlier heroes, with the omitted were grim. So what we're going to do here is simply to complete this comparison by making sure that we don't just have the focusing morpheme, but we also have the clause of comparison, so than earlier heroes. And the second thing that can happen is that we have the comparison changing in midstream in a sentence like, Conan is as grim, or even grimmer than Batman. So here we have two focusing words and morphemes. One is the word as, so as grim, which begins a comparison, which we think is going to be completed with a second as. Again, these ases are usually paired. And then we have, though, a second focusing, in this case, morpheme, which is the er, the comparative form of the adjective grim, so grimmer. And we can simply fix this by making sure that if we throw that first as in there, we do pair it with a second one so that each of the focusing words or morphemes is completed in its own right. So Conan is as grim as, or even grimmer than, Batman. And I like to set these clauses then off with hyphens, which I think makes the structure just visually neater. You can also use commas here. We're going to talk more about that in chapter 27 when we talk about the various uses of commas and hyphens. So either one is correct, but I prefer the hyphen. All right, so wrapping up. Ellipsis, which just means the omission of words, is a very common feature in language. And when you go to analyze a structure, you can get into trouble if you don't understand that words have been omitted, and that's the main reason to be aware of it. We do have optional ellipsis, and this often occurs in coordinate structures. And then required ellipsis frequently occurs in clauses of comparison, which are adverbial clauses that are preceded by a focusing morpheme. And finally, in your writing, just make sure to include both the focusing morpheme and the clause of comparison, and also make sure that if you do have more than one focusing morpheme, that you include the second one to avoid any awkward construction. So if you have one as, include the second, and if you have something like more, just make sure to include the adverbial clause of comparison, than Superman is strong.